Landon Myers had never considered himself someone easily swayed by admiration, especially when it came to his teachers. For as long as he could remember, he'd always been focused on his studies, his goals, and his plans for the future. He knew he had a talent for literature, and that talent had always been enough to set him apart from his peers, while others spent their free time partying, playing video games, or scrolling through their phones. Landon was most content with his nose buried in a book, surrounded by the comfort of words that spoke to him in ways people rarely did. It was this passion for literature that led him to Professor Ethan Calloway's class. From the first day, Landon knew he had found something special. Dr. Calloway wasn't like other professors, those who droned on endlessly, sucking the life out of even the most fascinating subjects. No, there was something about the way he taught that lit a fire in Landon's mind. Ethan had a natural charisma, the kind that didn't demand attention but invited it. His voice, deep and soothing, could effortlessly draw a room full of distracted students into the heart of whatever philosophical or literary topic they were discussing. His words seemed to wrap around the room, casting a spell that made time seem irrelevant. Ethan was in his late 40s, with a kind of quiet confidence that came from years of experience, both in academia and in life. His dark brown hair, threaded with streaks of silver, added a distinguished air to his already commanding presence. The silver-rimmed glasses he wore, perched low on his nose, seemed to give him an air of intellectual mystery, as if he could see right through you, reading not just your essay but the thoughts behind it. It wasn't just his appearance, though, that drew Landon's attention. It was the way Ethan handled himself in every situation, always calm, always composed, always in control. Landon couldn't pinpoint exactly when his admiration for Ethan began to shift into something more. Maybe it was during those long lectures where Ethan's eyes would occasionally meet his across the room, and for a brief second, it felt like they were the only two people there. Or maybe it was during the countless discussions they had in office hours, where Ethan would lean forward in his chair, genuinely listening as Landon eagerly dissected themes and motifs, his heart racing with the thrill of intellectual connection. The admiration Landon had for his professor had started out innocent enough. Ethan was everything Landon aspired to be: intelligent, articulate, respected. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, that admiration morphed into something deeper, something more complicated. He found himself looking forward to Ethan's classes in a way that went beyond his love of literature. He'd sit in the front row, his pulse quickening whenever Ethan entered the room. It wasn't just his mind that was engaged anymore. His heart, his emotions, and something else, something he barely dared to name, all became tied to this man who seemed so untouchable, so far above him. Landon tried to ignore it at first. It was a crush, he told himself. Just like any other, it would pass. It had to. After all, Ethan was his professor, a man who lived in a world of intellectual discourse and academic rigor. There was no place for feelings like this. But the more Landon tried to convince himself that his emotions were fleeting, the more they grew. Ethan's every word, every glance, every small smile directed his way seemed to light a fire within him, one that he couldn't put out. It was a day like any other, or so it seemed. The last bell of the day had rung, and the rest of the students filed out of the classroom with the usual chatter and commotion. Landon, however, lingered behind. He always did. There was something about the stillness of the room after everyone else had gone that made him feel like he could breathe again, like the world wasn't moving quite so fast. And of course, it gave him the perfect opportunity to finish up some extra work, an excuse to stay just a little longer in Ethan's presence. The classroom, usually filled with the rustling of papers and low murmurs of conversation, was now silent. Landon sat at his desk, the only sound being the faint scratch of his pen as he jotted down a few more notes for an upcoming assignment. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath his chair as he shifted, lost in thought. His mind, however, wasn't entirely focused on his work. It drifted, as it often did, back to Ethan. He could picture the way Ethan's hands moved as he explained complex ideas on the board, the way his voice would drop just a fraction when he wanted to emphasize a particularly important point. Landon's heart fluttered at the thought, but he quickly shook his head, trying to push the image away. He didn't notice when Ethan quietly approached his desk. Landon was so engrossed in his thoughts that the soft clearing of a throat startled him. His hand jerked slightly, the pen slipping from his grasp and clattering onto the desk. His breath caught in his throat as he looked up, his eyes meeting Ethan's. "You're still here," Ethan said, his voice low and calm, the kind of voice that could settle even the most frayed nerves. There was a hint of amusement in his tone, as if he'd expected nothing less from his most dedicated student. But there was something else, too. Something softer, more personal. Landon's heart skipped a beat, and he quickly lowered his gaze, trying to hide the heat rising in his cheeks. "Just finishing up this assignment," Landon mumbled, trying to sound casual, but his voice betrayed him with a slight tremor. He busied himself by pretending to organize his notes, even though they were already neatly stacked. Ethan gave him a gentle smile, the kind that made the corners of his eyes crinkle just slightly, softening his otherwise serious expression. "You're always so dedicated. It's admirable." The words hit Landon in a way he hadn't expected. There was something different in Ethan's tone, something that felt warmer, more personal than the usual praise he gave in class. Landon's face heated up further, and he tried to hide it by staring at the paper in front of him, though the words now blurred together. "You don't need to rush," Ethan added, and to Landon's surprise, he sat down at the desk next to him. "It's just you and me here now." Those words, simple as they were, sent a jolt through Landon's entire body. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. He could feel his breath hitch in his throat at the intimacy of the moment. Ethan had always been this figure of authority, the distant professor guiding him through the complexities of literature. But here, now in the quiet of the empty classroom, Ethan felt different. He wasn't just a professor. He was a man sitting so close that Landon could feel the warmth radiating from him. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like something was building, something that had been there for a while but had never been acknowledged. Landon's pulse raced in his ears, and he dared to glance up at Ethan. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Landon saw something in Ethan's gaze that he hadn't noticed before. They weren't just the eyes of a teacher anymore. They were the eyes of someone who saw him, really saw him. And in that moment, Landon felt an overwhelming surge of emotions that he couldn't quite name. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. "I've noticed you've been a bit distracted lately," Ethan said softly, leaning in just slightly, his voice carrying a gentle concern. "Is everything all right?" Landon swallowed hard, his mind racing. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could he explain the turmoil he felt inside? How could he explain that his distraction was standing right in front of him before he could gather his thoughts? Ethan's hand reached out, resting gently on his arm. The touch was soft, warm, and it sent a shiver through Landon's entire body. "It's okay," Ethan reassured him, his fingers lingering for a moment before slowly pulling away. The absence of his touch left Landon's skin tingling, and he found himself wishing Ethan hadn't let go so soon. The closeness between them was new, exciting, and yet a little terrifying. Landon had never thought of Ethan this way before, at least not consciously, but now sitting in the quiet of the classroom, with Ethan so near, the boundaries between them were blurring, and Landon wasn't sure where it would lead. All he knew was that something had shifted, and there was no going back. And so, what had started as an ordinary day became the beginning of something that would change Landon's life forever. The stillness in the room was palpable after Ethan sat beside Landon, the air between them thickening with a tension that hadn't been there before. It was a quiet moment, one that should have felt ordinary, a professor and his student discussing coursework after class. But nothing about it felt ordinary to Landon. His pulse quickened with each passing second as the warmth of Ethan's presence filled the space beside him. Landon tried to focus on the paper in front of him, but the words blurred into meaningless lines. His thoughts were racing, tumbling over one another in a chaotic mess he couldn't sort out. The simple act of Ethan sitting so close, their knees almost brushing under the desk, was enough to send a jolt of nervous energy through him. Landon had always been composed, known for his academic poise, but now he felt utterly disarmed. He couldn't ignore the closeness of his professor, or the strange new intimacy that had crept into their interactions. Ethan's voice broke the silence, low and almost hesitant, as though he, too, was testing the boundaries of whatever this was between them. "You've been working hard, haven't you?" His words were a compliment, but there was an edge to his tone, something softer, almost personal. It wasn't the formal praise of a professor commending a diligent student. It was more. Landon felt his cheeks flush, and he quickly looked down, not trusting himself to meet Ethan's eyes. I like to stay on top of things. Landon mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. He hoped it sounded casual, but the tremor in his words betrayed him. His hands gripped the pen on the desk tighter, his knuckles white. He was acutely aware of how close Ethan was sitting. The way his body seemed to fill the space between them, making the room feel smaller, more intimate. It was a strange sensation, this sudden awareness of Ethan not as a distant authority figure, but as a man, an undeniable presence. Ethan's gaze lingered on him, and Landon could feel it like a weight pressing against his chest. He didn't dare look up. His heart was pounding too loudly in his ears, and he was certain his professor would be able to hear it if he came any closer. You've always been a standout in this class, Ethan continued, his voice softening even more. Landon could hear the shift, the way Ethan's words seemed to hold a deeper meaning. But lately, I've noticed you seem distracted. Landon's heart skipped a beat. He froze, feeling exposed, as if Ethan had reached inside his head and pulled out the very thoughts he'd been struggling to hide. Did Ethan know? Had he somehow seen the way Landon's eyes lingered on him during lectures? Or how he stayed after class, not just to finish assignments, but to be near him? Swallowing hard, Landon forced himself to respond, though his voice was shaky. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. But before he could finish, Ethan's hand reached out, gently placing it on his arm, stopping him mid-sentence. The touch was soft, but it sent a shockwave through Landon's body. His breath caught in his throat, and the world seemed to slow down in that moment. The room grew warmer, and the spot where Ethan's hand rested on his arm burned with a sensation that was both thrilling and terrifying. Landon looked down at Ethan's hand, his thoughts swirling, trying to make sense of what was happening. Ethan didn't move his hand right away. Instead, his fingers lingered, the weight of the gesture heavy with something unspoken. There was nothing overtly inappropriate about the touch. It could easily have been dismissed as a simple, reassuring gesture between a professor and a student. But in the silence of that room, with no one else around, it felt like so much more. It felt like a boundary had been crossed, even if neither of them had yet admitted it out loud. It's okay, Ethan said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper now. His eyes searched Landon's face, and for the first time, Landon saw something in them he hadn't noticed before. A vulnerability, a quiet uncertainty that mirrored his own. Landon's skin tingled where Ethan's hand rested, and when his professor finally pulled away, the absence of the touch left him feeling cold, hollow. He found himself wishing Ethan hadn't let go so soon, that the moment hadn't ended. The silence that followed felt different now, charged with a new kind of energy that neither of them seemed to know how to handle. Landon's breath came in shallow bursts as he finally dared to glance up, meeting Ethan's gaze. The intensity in Ethan's eyes made Landon's stomach tighten, and he had to look away again, his heart pounding too hard to think clearly. There was something unspoken hanging between them now, a fragile, delicate thread of tension that neither of them seemed willing to acknowledge. But it was there. I've noticed, Ethan said quietly, that you're not just distracted in class. There's something else, something that's been on your mind. The words hit Landon like a weight, and he could feel his defenses crumbling. He wanted to deny it, to brush it off, but he couldn't. Not now. Not when Ethan was looking at him like that, as if he could see straight through him, straight into the parts of Landon he had tried so hard to keep hidden. Landon started, his voice barely audible, his throat tight. He didn't know what to say. How could he explain what he was feeling without crossing a line he wasn't sure he was ready to cross? It's the confusion, the pull toward Ethan, the emotions that had been building inside him for weeks. All of it was too much to put into words. Before he could gather his thoughts, Ethan stood up, the chair scraping softly against the floor as he rose. Landon's heart sank, thinking that maybe Ethan was about to walk away, that the moment was over, that everything was about to go back to normal, whatever normal could mean after this. But then, instead of leaving, Ethan walked over to the door and quietly clicked the lock into place. The sound echoed in the stillness of the room, and Landon's heart leaped into his throat. He turned to face Ethan, his breath catching as the reality of the situation hit him. They were truly alone now, locked in this small room together, with no one else to interrupt them, no one else to stop whatever was about to happen next. Ethan turned back toward Landon, his expression soft but serious. He took a few steps forward, closing the distance between them until he was standing just inches away. The warmth from Ethan's body was almost overwhelming now, and Landon could feel it radiating from him, surrounding him, pulling him in. "You don't have to say anything," Ethan said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I know this is unusual." Landon could hardly breathe as Ethan reached out, his hand brushing a strand of hair from Landon's forehead with such tenderness that it made Landon's heart ache. His fingers grazed Landon's cheek, and Landon leaned into the touch, his body betraying him, craving more of the warmth and safety that Ethan seemed to offer. "I've watched you grow," Ethan murmured, his thumb gently tracing the curve of Landon's jaw. "Not just as a student, but as a person. There's something about you that draws me in, something I can't ignore anymore." Landon's mind was spinning, his emotions swirling in a confusing, intoxicating mix of fear and desire. Could this be happening? Could this possibly be real? Every logical part of him screamed that this was wrong, that they shouldn't be here, that they shouldn't be feeling what they were feeling. He had an nonsense, but every other part of him, the part that longed for this, that had been yearning for this connection, told him that he didn't want it to stop, that he couldn't let it stop. "Ethan," he whispered, barely able to form the words. The weight of his professor's name on his tongue felt intimate, forbidden, but so right at the same time. He looked up into Ethan's eyes, and in that moment he knew there was no going back. The quiet moment had turned personal, in a way that neither of them could deny now. In the days that followed, Landon couldn't shake the sensation that something between him and Ethan had shifted irrevocably. Every moment in class seemed to carry an unspoken weight, a tension that only they could feel. The room was filled with students discussing literary theory or quietly taking notes. But for Landon, it felt like there was only one person in that room who mattered: Ethan. Every glance they exchanged held an intensity that hadn't been there before. Landon could sense it in the way Ethan's eyes would linger on him, just a fraction too long, or how his voice seemed to soften whenever he addressed Landon directly. It was subtle, but undeniable. Landon felt a constant, simmering awareness of Ethan, as if the air itself crackled with anticipation whenever they were near each other. He found himself replaying their interactions over and over in his mind, questioning every look, every word, every fleeting touch that seemed so innocent, but now felt loaded with meaning. One afternoon, about a week after that moment in the classroom, Landon found himself staying behind again. This time, though, it wasn't because of unfinished work or the need to focus on an assignment. It was something deeper, something that had been building inside him, a need to be close to Ethan, to feel that connection again. The last of the students filed out of the classroom, their footsteps echoing down the corridor as they chatted and laughed, unaware of the turmoil brewing inside Landon. He sat at his desk, his heart pounding with nervous energy. His hands fidgeted with his notebook, but his mind wasn't on the pages in front of him. It was on Ethan, who sat at his own desk, quietly reviewing papers. Landon stole a glance in Ethan's direction, his eyes tracing the familiar lines of his professor's face. There was something about the quiet concentration on Ethan's face that made Landon's chest tighten. He wanted, no, needed, something from Ethan, but he wasn't sure how to ask for it. The uncertainty gnawed at him, and the longer he sat there, the more unbearable it became. Finally, unable to stand the tension any longer, Landon stood up from his desk. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were testing the waters, waiting to see if Ethan would notice. When Ethan didn't immediately look up, Landon took a deep breath and crossed the room, his footsteps soft but purposeful. He stopped in front of Ethan's desk, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. For a second, he considered turning back, walking out of the room, pretending that everything was normal. But his heart was pounding too loudly in his chest, and the pull toward Ethan was too strong to ignore. "Professor Calloway," Landon started, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked up from his papers, his eyes meeting Landon's. There was a flicker of surprise in his expression, as though he hadn't expected Landon to linger, but that surprise quickly faded. replaced by something else. Something unspoken. Landon's breath hitched in his throat. He could feel his palms growing clammy, his pulse racing in his ears. His throat was dry, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. He had to say something. He had to break the silence that had been building between them for days. Ethan, he whispered, the name slipping from his lips before he even realized he had spoken it. It felt strange and intimate to say his professor's first name out loud, but in this moment, it was the only thing that felt right. Ethan blinked, his brow furrowing slightly as he set the papers down. His gaze held steady on Landon, searching his face for something, an explanation perhaps, or a sign of what this was all about. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, charged with emotions that neither of them seemed able to put into words. Finally, Ethan broke the tension, his voice low and careful. Landon, is everything all right? Landon swallowed hard, his hands balling into fists at his sides as he tried to find the right words. How could he explain the confusion swirling inside him? The way his thoughts had been consumed by Ethan ever since that moment in the classroom. The way every touch, every glance, every whispered word seemed to mean so much more now. I can't stop thinking about you, Landon blurted out, the confession spilling from his lips before he could stop himself. His cheeks flushed instantly, the weight of the words hanging heavy in the air between them. Ethan's expression changed in an instant. His eyes widened slightly, and for a second, Landon saw something flash across his face. Surprise, maybe, or perhaps a deeper recognition of what was being said. But whatever it was quickly masked by a careful, measured expression. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his hands folding together as he regarded Landon with a mix of concern and curiosity. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked quietly, though his voice held a hint of understanding. Landon could tell that Ethan already knew, or at least suspected, what Landon was trying to say. But he was giving him the space to explain, to put his feelings into words. Landon's chest tightened, his nerves getting the better of him. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to leap into the unknown. But he couldn't hold it in anymore. The feelings he had for Ethan had grown too large, too overwhelming, to keep locked away. I think about you all the time, Landon continued, his voice trembling. He could barely look at Ethan now, his eyes flicking nervously to the side. When I'm in class, when I'm not, I don't know when it started, but I can't stop. I don't just see you as my professor anymore. The confession hung in the air like a fragile thread, and Landon waited, his heart pounding, for Ethan's reaction. Every second felt like an eternity as Ethan processed the words, his gaze still steady on Landon's face. Ethan's expression softened, and for a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. Something warm, something vulnerable. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk as he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. Landon, he began, his tone gentle but firm. I've noticed it too. The way things have changed between us, and I can't pretend that I haven't felt something too. Landon's heart leaped at the admission, his breath catching in his throat. He looked up, meeting Ethan's eyes again, searching for confirmation of what he thought he had just heard. Ethan hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. He reached out, his hand hovering just above Landon's, but he didn't touch him. Not yet. But this is complicated, Ethan continued, his voice laced with a mixture of hesitation and concern. You know that, don't you? Landon nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Of course he knew it was complicated. Ethan was his professor, and there were boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. But those boundaries felt like they had already started to crumble, and now they were standing in the wreckage, unsure of where to go from here. I don't care about the rules, Landon whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. I can't help how I feel. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath as if trying to steady himself. When he opened them again, his gaze was softer, filled with something that made Landon's heart ache. It wasn't just desire. It was a deep, unspoken connection, one that neither of them had fully acknowledged until now. I know, Ethan said quietly. I feel it too. But we have to be careful. For a long moment, they just stood there, the weight of their shared confession settling over them like a blanket. Neither of them knew what would happen next, but in that moment, The truth had been spoken. There was no going back now. In the weeks that followed their confession, everything changed for Landon and Ethan. It was as though a secret world had opened up between them, one that existed just out of sight from the rest of the university. Their connection was no longer something vague and unspoken, but something real, something tangible, and yet it had to remain hidden. This need for secrecy only heightened the intensity of what was happening between them. Every class became a minefield of stolen glances and charged silences. Landon would sit in his usual seat, trying to focus on Ethan's lectures, but his mind was no longer on literary theory or philosophical debates. Every time Ethan's eyes met his across the room, it sent a jolt through him, as if the air between them had been electrified. There was an unspoken understanding now, a knowledge that they shared something no one else could know. For Ethan, too, it was becoming harder to maintain the distance he'd always held with his students. Whenever he called on Landon in class, his voice would falter for just a fraction of a second, and his gaze would linger a moment too long. His once measured professional tone was laced with something warmer, something more intimate. It was subtle, something that no one else seemed to notice, but Landon felt it with every word Ethan directed at him. And it wasn't just in the classroom. The quiet moments after class, when the other students had left and it was just the two of them, became the moments they both lived for. Landon would stay behind, pretending to finish up work, but they both knew the real reason he was there. Ethan would lock the door, the click of the lock echoing in the empty room. And in that small act, they created a bubble of privacy, a space where the outside world couldn't touch them. At first, those moments were filled with tentative conversation, awkward but exhilarating. They would sit close, but not too close, their words careful, as though they were still testing the limits of what was happening between them. But with each passing day, the barrier between them weakened, and the closeness they both craved became harder to resist. One afternoon, after the last student had filed out, Landon lingered longer than usual, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't have any work to finish. He just needed to be near Ethan, to feel the way he made the world fall away when they were alone. He stood by his desk, nervously shifting from foot to foot, unsure of how to initiate what he knew was about to happen. Ethan, sensing the shift, looked up from his desk. His eyes met Landon's, and in that moment, everything between them felt charged with anticipation. Without a word, Ethan stood and walked to the door, locking it once again. The sound of the lock seemed louder this time, a clear signal that whatever was about to happen would be kept safely behind closed doors. Landon's heart raced as Ethan approached him. There was a seriousness in his expression, but there was also something else, desire, barely held back. They had kissed once before, but this felt different. There was no uncertainty now, no hesitation. They both knew what they wanted, and the thrill of it, the fact that they weren't supposed to want it, that it was forbidden, only made the desire more intoxicating. Ethan stopped just inches away from Landon, his presence overwhelming. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing against Landon's cheek with the same tenderness that had made Landon's heart ache the first time. But this time, Landon didn't hesitate. He leaned into the touch, his breath shallow as he felt Ethan's fingers trail down to his jawline. "I've been thinking about you," Ethan murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I've tried to stay away, but—" Landon's breath caught in his throat, and his pulse quickened. The closeness between them, the heat of Ethan's body just inches from his, was dizzying. He wanted to close the distance, to feel Ethan's lips on his again. But there was still a small part of him that hesitated, wondering how far they could go before the world came crashing down around them. "What do we do?" Landon asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. He looked up at Ethan, his eyes filled with the same conflict that had been gnawing at him since their first kiss. For a moment, Ethan didn't respond. He just looked at Landon, his expression unreadable. But then, slowly, a soft smile curved his lips, and he reached out, pulling Landon closer. His hands came to rest on Landon's waist, and the warmth of his touch sent a shiver through him. "We take it slow," Ethan said softly, his voice gentle but firm. "We figure this out together." Landon nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. This wasn't just a fleeting moment of weakness, some brief, irrational desire. What they had was real, and it was worth exploring. even if it was complicated, even if it was dangerous. Ethan leaned down, his lips brushing against Landon's in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative, as though they were both testing the boundaries of what felt right and wrong. But as the kiss deepened, the passion between them broke free, no longer held back by fear or uncertainty. Landon's arms wrapped around Ethan's neck, pulling him closer, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the world had disappeared. In those stolen moments, locked away from the rest of the world, they built something fragile but beautiful. Their relationship existed in the quiet, in the secret spaces they could carve out between classes, or in the solitude of Ethan's office. They couldn't afford to let anyone know, couldn't risk being seen together outside of those small, intimate moments. But that only made it more thrilling. Every glance across the classroom, every brush of hands when no one was looking, felt electric. It was a dangerous game they were playing, but neither of them could bring themselves to stop. The secrecy, the knowledge that they were breaking rules, only intensified their connection. Each moment they spent together felt like stolen time, a forbidden treasure that they held close to their hearts. And yet, as the days passed, the weight of their secret began to press down on them. It became harder to hide, harder to pretend that nothing had changed between them. The risk of being discovered loomed over every interaction, a constant reminder of what they were putting on the line. But no matter how much the fear grew, Landon couldn't stay away from Ethan. He didn't want to. The thrill of their forbidden love was too strong, too intoxicating to let go. One afternoon, as they sat together in Ethan's office after class, the reality of their situation began to sink in. Ethan took Landon's hand in his expression serious. "We have to be careful," he murmured, his voice filled with regret. "We can't let anyone know." Landon nodded, his fingers tracing the collar of Ethan's shirt. "I know," he whispered, "but I don't care. I just want to be with you." Ethan smiled at that, a soft, almost wistful smile, and pressed a kiss to Landon's forehead. "We'll figure it out," he promised, his voice filled with quiet determination. One step at a time, and so they continued their secret relationship, living in the moments they could steal away from the world. It was thrilling, terrifying, and beautiful all at once. But as the risks grew, so did the intensity of their connection. Boundaries between them had long since disappeared, and there was no going back now. What they had was forbidden, but it was also undeniable, and neither of them was willing to let it go. As the weeks wore on, the weight of the secret Landon and Ethan shared became increasingly difficult to bear. What had started as exhilarating and forbidden had begun to shift into something far heavier, something that gnawed at them both in ways they hadn't anticipated. The moments they spent together were intoxicating, but the moments apart, when they had to pretend nothing had changed. Landon could feel the strain in every interaction, not just with Ethan but with everyone around him. He had to act normal, like nothing was different, like his world hadn't been turned upside down by a man who, by all accounts, should have remained a distant authority. But everything had changed, and the effort to conceal it was wearing him down. In class, Landon felt as though he was walking on a tightrope. Every time Ethan addressed him, every time their eyes met, he was hyper-aware of the risk they were taking. He couldn't help but wonder if anyone else noticed the lingering looks, the slight pause in Ethan's voice when he spoke to him. He found himself scrutinizing the reactions of the other students, watching for any sign that someone might suspect what was really going on. But if anyone did notice, they didn't say a word. To the rest of the world, everything remained unchanged. But inside, Landon was unraveling. The secrecy, the constant need for caution, had turned their stolen moments into something bittersweet. He craved more time, more closeness, more honesty. But they couldn't have that, not in the open, not without risking everything. And so every touch, every kiss they shared behind locked doors was tinged with the knowledge that it could all come crashing down at any moment. Ethan, too, was beginning to feel the pressure. As much as he tried to remain calm and composed, Landon could see the strain in his eyes. He had always been the picture of control, measured, thoughtful, never one to let his emotions get the better of him. But now, there were cracks in that facade. When they were alone together, Landon could feel the tension in Ethan's touch, the way his hands would linger on Landon's skin, as if he were trying to hold on to something slipping away. And it wasn't just the fear of being discovered that weighed on them. There was also the ever-present reality of the imbalance of power between them. Ethan was still Landon's professor, still the man responsible for his academic future, and that fact couldn't be ignored, even in their most intimate moments. That knowledge hovered in the background, a reminder of the precariousness of their situation. One afternoon, after yet another secret meeting in Ethan's office, the weight of it all became too much to ignore. They had spent the better part of an hour talking quietly, their fingers intertwined as they sat close, the world outside feeling impossibly far away. But as the conversation waned, the silence between them grew heavy, the unspoken fears and doubts pressing down on them. Ethan let out a long sigh, his hand tightening around Landon's. "We can't keep doing this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't the first time he had said those words, but this time they felt different. There was a sadness in his tone that hadn't been there before, a resignation that made Landon's chest ache. Landon swallowed hard, the knot in his throat tightening. He had known this conversation was coming, but that didn't make it any easier to hear. "I know," he replied softly, though every part of him wanted to argue, to tell Ethan that they could find a way to make it work. But deep down, he knew the truth. They were living on borrowed time, and eventually, the truth would catch up with them. Ethan looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and something deeper, something that Landon couldn't quite name. "If anyone finds out," Ethan didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. They both knew the consequences. It wasn't just Ethan's job on the line or Landon's academic future. There was something more personal at stake, the connection they had built, fragile and beautiful but constantly under threat. "I don't want to lose you," Landon whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He could feel the tears welling up in his eyes, but he blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. He had always prided himself on being strong, on not letting his emotions get the better of him. But this was different. This was Ethan, the man who had become so much more than a professor, the man who had shown him a side of himself he hadn't known existed. "You won't," Ethan replied, his voice gentle but firm. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Landon's face, his fingers lingering for a moment before pulling away. "No matter what happens, you'll always have a place in my heart." The words were meant to be reassuring, but they felt like a goodbye. Landon's chest tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. He didn't know how to say goodbye to something that had become such an integral part of his life. He didn't know how to let go of the one person who made him feel seen in a way no one else ever had. "I don't know how to say goodbye," Landon admitted, his voice breaking as the weight of their situation crashed down on him. He'd been holding on for so long, trying to convince himself that they could make it work, that they could somehow navigate the impossible. But now, with Ethan sitting in front of him, his expression filled with the same conflict that had been tearing Landon apart, he couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Ethan's face softened, and he pulled Landon into his arms, holding him tightly. "You don't have to," he whispered, his breath warm against Landon's ear. "This isn't goodbye. It's just..." Landon clung to Ethan, his body trembling with the effort of holding back the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He didn't want this to end, didn't want to let go of the one person who made him feel truly alive, but he knew they couldn't keep living in the shadows, hiding from the world. It wasn't sustainable, and sooner or later something would break. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the quiet of the empty office, neither of them wanting to let go. The weight of their secret, once thrilling and dangerous, had become too heavy to carry. But even as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Landon knew that what they had shared wasn't over. It couldn't be. There was something between them, something real and undeniable. And no matter how hard they tried to walk away from it, it would always be there waiting. When they finally pulled apart, Landon felt like a part of him was being torn away. Ethan's hand lingered on his arm for just a moment longer before he let go, stepping back with a soft sigh. "We'll find each other again," Ethan said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "When the time is right." Landon nodded, though the ache in his chest made it hard to believe. He wanted to trust Ethan's words, to believe that this wasn't the end. But as he walked out of the office that day, leaving Ethan behind, the weight of their secret still heavy on his shoulders. He couldn't help but wonder how long they could keep waiting for that elusive right time. The burden of secrecy had taken its toll, and as much as they had tried to live in the fleeting moments of stolen passion, the reality of their situation had finally caught up with them. And now, as Landon stepped into the cold air outside, he knew that no matter how much he wanted to hold on, the weight of their secret had become too much for either of them to carry alone. The days after their final conversation were some of the hardest Landon had ever endured. Walking away from Ethan, knowing that their relationship, if you could even call it that, had to end, felt like tearing away a piece of himself. The weight of their goodbye, though unspoken and temporary, lingered over him like a shadow. The connection that had once felt so exhilarating now felt like a wound, raw and aching. At first, Landon tried to numb himself with his usual routines. He threw himself into his studies, pouring every ounce of his energy into schoolwork, trying to distract himself from the overwhelming sense of loss that had settled in his chest. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the reminders of Ethan that seemed to be everywhere. Every time he walked into the classroom, the memories of their stolen moments flooded his mind. He couldn't look at Ethan without feeling a pang of longing. Every glance, every fleeting touch in passing now felt like a reminder of what they had shared and what they had lost. Ethan, too, was different. Though he tried to maintain his usual professionalism, there was a tension in his movements, a slight hesitation in his voice. When he addressed Landon in front of the class, their secret still hung between them like a delicate thread, unspoken but undeniably present. And it wasn't just in the classroom. Every quiet hallway, every empty office after hours, reminded Landon of the moments they had spent together. He couldn't walk past Ethan's office without feeling the ghost of those intense, private conversations, the weight of their confessions. Even the sound of a door closing brought back the memory of that unmistakable click of the lock, the signal that they were safe for just a little while, hidden away from the rest of the world. Landon had thought that ending things would bring him some kind of relief, that letting go would free him from the constant anxiety of keeping their secret. But instead, it left him hollow. He had lost something, something that had felt more real, more meaningful than anything he'd ever experienced before. And though he told himself it was for the best, that they had made the right decision, the pain of that decision lingered, sharp and persistent. The worst part was that Ethan was still there, every day. He wasn't some distant memory that Landon could slowly forget. He was a constant presence in Landon's life, standing at the front of the classroom, guiding discussions, grading papers, living his life as though nothing had changed. But something had changed. Everything had. And every day, Landon had to sit in the same room as him, pretending that they were just professor and student, pretending that their connection hadn't run far deeper than that. It was excruciating. And yet, despite the pain, Landon couldn't bring himself to regret it. He couldn't regret the time they had spent together, the intensity of their relationship, the way Ethan had made him feel. In those moments, he had felt truly seen, truly understood in a way no one else had ever made him feel. Ethan had opened up a part of him that he hadn't even known existed. And now that part of him couldn't be closed off again, no matter how much he tried. Landon often found himself thinking about Ethan in the quiet moments, when the world was still and his thoughts ran rampant. He wondered if Ethan was thinking about him too. If the older man lay awake at night, his mind drifting back to those secret meetings, the kisses that had once felt so forbidden, but now seemed like the only real thing in a world filled with pretense. He wondered if Ethan missed him, if he felt the same aching emptiness that Landon felt every time their eyes met and quickly darted away. One afternoon, as Landon was packing up his things after class, he heard Ethan's voice, low, soft, just above a whisper. Landon. The sound of his name, spoken in that familiar, gentle tone, made his heart skip a beat. He turned slowly, his pulse racing, unsure of what to expect. Ethan stood near the door, his expression unreadable for a moment. They just looked at each other, the silence between them filled with all the things they couldn't say. "I'll miss you," Ethan finally said, his voice thick with emotion. The words hit Landon like a physical blow, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. He hadn't been prepared for this, for the finality of it all. He had thought that maybe, just maybe, They could continue as they were, living in the tension, in the unspoken connection that still lingered between them. But hearing those words spoken so quietly shattered that hope. "I'll miss you too," Landon whispered, his throat tight. There was so much more he wanted to say, but the words stuck in his throat, refusing to come out. He wanted to tell Ethan how much he meant to him, how he had changed his life, how he would never be the same after everything they had shared, but he couldn't. The moment was too fragile, too heavy with everything they couldn't express. Ethan's eyes softened, and for a second, it looked like he might say more, that he might break through the barrier that had formed between them since they decided to end things. But instead, he just nodded, his gaze filled with an unspoken sadness. And then, without another word, Ethan turned and walked away, leaving Landon standing there, the weight of their unspoken feelings hanging heavy in the air behind him. As Landon watched him go, he felt an overwhelming sense of loss, not just for Ethan, but for the version of himself that he had been when they were together. When he was with Ethan, he had felt wanted, desired, special. Now, without him, he wasn't sure how to find that version of himself again. In the days that followed, Landon tried to move on. He told himself that it was for the best, that they had made the right choice. He focused on his schoolwork, on his friends, on the parts of his life that had nothing to do with Ethan. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, that something important had been lost. The pain of letting go wasn't just about losing Ethan. It was about losing the connection they had built, the intimacy that had grown between them in the quiet, hidden corners of their world. It was about knowing that, no matter what happened, a part of him would always belong to Ethan, just as a part of Ethan would always belong to him. And so Landon continued on, pretending that he was fine, that he had moved on. But deep down, he knew the truth. He knew that what he and Ethan had shared wasn't something that could be easily forgotten. It wasn't something that could be erased by time or distance. It had changed him, marked him in a way that was permanent. The pain of letting go might have dulled with time, but it would never fully disappear. Because no matter where life took them, no matter how far apart they were, a part of Landon would always be with Ethan, and a part of Ethan would always be with him.